Here we are, the final stop of my remastered rankings for each season of Death Battle. This one has quite the reputation in the community. Let's see if it's just as bad as everyone says, or if my older, more positive opinion of it still holds up.
But what is a man? A miserable pile of secrets.
Point taken, Dracula. I'll get out of your hair.
Batgirl vs. Spider-Gwen is a bad episode. I know, right? Most nuclear take of the century. I don't think ranking this one this low is going to be a shock to many people, but what might is the fact that I don't hate this episode. I dislike it quite a bit, but I can't say I outright consider it awful. I'd only give that title to like 5 episodes in the series, and this is a good bit better than those ones. Though that's not because of the animation. In fact, going off just the fight, I would call it awful. The SFM team had previously given us Ganondorf vs. Dracula and Obi Wan vs. Kakashi, two of my favourite episodes that play into the team's strengths, with expressive facial animations, tons of varied abilities, and great looking effects. Batgirl vs. Spider-Gwen has hardly any of that. Barbara's comparatively far less expressive, even if I don't despise her character model like some people do, and Gwen is doing better in a lot of areas, but then you get stuff like her eyes tearing open to reveal the infinite dark abyss inside her head. And on the other end, Source Filmmakers clearly not a software intended for intense hand-to-hand combat. As I've been told by people who've actually used the program, that stuff takes a lot more time to fine-tune and is really not suited for SFM over other software, which leads to this having a lot of jank. There are very few movements in this I can say don't look off in some way, and it persists throughout the entire thing. Whenever they're throwing hands or changing poses in any kind of dynamic way, it looks as stiff as you can fill in the blank and really takes me out of it. There are also some really bafflingly stupid things happening in the choreography. Gwen at 2 different points is about to have a gimmick battering zap her or blow up in her face. The first time she just sits and watches it happen. The second she holds onto the batarang and remarks at how she shouldn't have done it instead of, I don't know, throwing the batarang back. If only she had some kind of sixth sense that warns her about danger ahead of time, that'd probably be helpful. This bit here has Batgirl's hand get stuck to her leg, which causes her to reel in pain while holding her arm, which is also no longer stuck in the very next shot. What? Gwen uses her invisibility, and Barbara waits a few seconds before attacking the spot she had clearly just left, as Gwen drops down on this rock and then immediately jumps back up in the same direction she came from, never even showing her exiting her invisibility. Cool. Gwen holds onto Barbara with this really static looking web, which apparently translates to Barbara being pulled up at the speed of light before she rips the web apart with her bare hands. Sure, that isn't immersion breaking at all. There's a confusing bit where the camera zooms in on Gwen's eyes like it's transitioning to a first person perspective shot, and then it just cuts to a different part of the cave altogether. Stuff will disappear and reappear between shots with no rhyme or reason. And of course there's the peak of the episode, this shot right here with Gwen pulling the batarang out of her wrist. Simply stunning. Man, this episode could have been fun if given to the team that actually specializes in hand-to-hand choreography, because take away the jank and actually let them use their unique equipment like Gwen summoning more spiders and Barbara using her various non-lethal guns, or even just let them use stuff like the invisibility and electric batons in ways that are actually interesting, and you could have had a good spiritual successor to the first Batman vs. Spider-Man. You want me to list all the positives I have with the fight? The voice acting's fine, the effects on Gwen's initial appearance with the dimensional travel thing are pretty good, Gwen's model for Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3 is good even if it clashes with Barbara's comparatively much worse one. In spite of the awkward posing and stiff movements, I like the concept of them going in front of the aspect ratio when Gwen dodging these batarangs is a reference to the Raimi trilogy, and the death is good in concept even if it's ruined by the execution and how funny Batgirl's face is. Wow, almost all of that had a catch. The animation even opens with a better episode I wish I was watching instead. And considering that episode is She-Ra vs. Wonder Woman, and you'll see how soon I get to talk about that one, that is saying quite a bit. Wait, so why do I say I don't hate the episode then? Clearly I don't have anything unironically nice to say about it that doesn't have some kind of caveat. Well, that's looking at just the animation. I think the analysis for this one is actually really good. I've heard some people don't like how Boomstick acts in Barbara's analysis with his discount version of that one Knuckles joke in Sonic Boom, but I didn't mind it. Worst I can say is it might come across as a bit patronizing, but that's also hardly my place to be saying that. The only part of the analysis I dislike is that one random quirky taco line. The rest is a surprisingly interesting coverage of the stories and the struggles they faced with Barbara's paralysis and Gwen's public unmasking. It's also got good jokes for the most part, 2 good cutaways, one of which is my favourite dummy skit of the season, and this has the best editing of any Season 7 analysis. Nick really went crazy with this one, it looks fantastic. Not much more to say beyond this is probably one of the better analyses this season gave us, and when it's attached to a fight as shithouse as this one, that just makes me appreciate it even more.
The Kingdom of Germa.
To be honest, I kind of expected to rank Sanji vs Rock Lee in dead last. While the animation isn't the unprecedented failure that Batgwen was, I also didn't remember it having an analysis good enough to boost it much higher. But on a rewatch, I actually kinda liked the analysis. Rock Lee's was whatever, Dummy Skit was fine, and I liked learning about Lee's childhood struggles and all that, but nothing about it sticks with me, especially compared to all of the other Naruto rundowns. In fact, besides Sasuke, this is probably my least favourite of that bunch. Sanji's analysis though was really fun. I found his story way more interesting to follow. One Piece's lack of prior representation to the same extent as Naruto meant it didn't blend in with any other episodes. I was chuckling at a few of the jokes, and some of the editing tricks like this bit at the start are incredible. This was originally a single still image, and I am blown away by how Nick was able to bring it to life. So with an analysis that I enjoyed, why did this rank so low? Well, it's a Season 7 sprite fight that uses a custom rig, so that's a great sign. I really wish they'd taken after the 1 minute melee and just used the JUS sprites instead of going out of their way to make custom Lee sprites, which, well, they suffer the same issues a lot of sprite rigs do this season, with the static posing a lot of the time and the janky movements. Except this one has the added bonus of just not working sometimes. There are some points where his body will disconnect, and some poses he does look outright wrong, like the Hidden Lotus, which does not at all look like he's winding up for a punch. His hands pretty much always look weird actually. Sanji on the other hand, his sprites look incredible. I know his base ones aren't custom, but his raid suit is. It looks great and seems to move naturally for the entire time it's out. And while I'm complimenting the visuals, the hand-drawn stuff is really nice. It's about the only thing saving the death, but we'll get there. So half the fight looks great and half of it doesn't, to put it lightly. Fortunately, the quality in the audio side of things is a lot more consistent. Unfortunately, that consistency doesn't mean it's good. There are a lot of weak sound effects that fail to sell the strength behind a lot of attacks, as well as probably the overall weakest set of voice acting this season has. I'm not that familiar with Mark Phillips' work at all. I hear he's really talented at making comedy skits, and I don't doubt that, but this episode doesn't let him show off any talent he'd have at voice acting because a lot of Lee's lines are pretty poorly delivered on top of just not sounding like himself. Sanji's voice probably fits him better. Young Ye sounds the part comparatively, but a lot of his lines are also delivered in a strange way that makes me think both voice actors just had really poor direction, as opposed to not being well suited for the roles. To be fair though, even if the performances were good, they would not have been able to salvage the fight script, because oh boy, the writing here is far from the best the season has seen. So I'm not the most knowledgeable on Naruto, right? Never seen an episode or read a chapter. That said, I do know from what literally everybody I have ever talked to about Rock Lee, as well as the wiki, that he is incapable of disliking any food. So the battle starts because he doesn't like Sanji's food. He complains the curry is far too mild, even though his face went red beforehand. This is visual shorthand for two possible options, and I don't see Ryu Street Fighter in the background anywhere. Then Lee starts acting like an ass, and Sanji's not able to carry it this time because he starts acting equally stupidly. This is the kind of shit you turn in as a joke before the first draft. The start of the fight portrays both of these two as massive pricks, and is similar to Aang vs Ed in the sense that I went in not knowing a character, and came out thinking I wouldn't like them because of how they were presented, before later finding out they're one of the worst examples of character assassination Death Battle has ever done. Sanji doesn't get much better later on. He has one of the most awkward lines I've ever heard right before he kills Lee, and then he gets an actually cool line afterwards, but then he decides to keep going and okay, now you've ruined it. Is the fight at least well choreographed? Well, I appreciate them using Drunken Lee, but I don't appreciate that it means he has to speedrun through the gates. If he'd started in his drunken state, accidentally did something to start the fight and then sobered up, that could have worked. But as it is, the drunken state takes time away from the rest of the fight, so it means he has to go through the 5th, 6th, and 7th gates within the span of like 30 seconds with no real reason. He's at an advantage for most of the fight and only transforms for, I don't know, the sake of hitting Sanji harder, I guess. I do like that he tries to shut down Sanji's raid suit before he can use it, and that's about all Lee does in the fight that I like. Is Sanji faring any better? Well, he has the best hand-on stuff and he kicks Lee into becoming handsome Squidward. And now I have run through basically all of my positives for the fight. Well, except for the pretty good track. I quite like Full Course Will. Oh yeah, and there's a whole bit with the 8th gate. Unlike with Might Guy, who has to use it in a literal do-or-die situation, giving us one of the best transformations Death Battle has ever seen, leading up to a really intense final shot, Lee busts it out after getting hit like twice. Also, this works into how not very well put together the conclusion is, because their whole argument is that Sanji would just dodge Lee until he died from using the 8th gate, assuming he would never try to block or anything. This is Sanji's main win con since he is not even in the same ballpark of strength as Lee, and couldn't hope to even hurt him. So the animation has Lee blitzing around Sanji, they have a clash where they're about even with Sanji losing a leg but still being able to send Lee back down to the ground and doing some damage, and then Sanji two-shots him. Okay. And when Lee takes out Sanji's leg, he doesn't even react to it. No scream, not even a grunt to show that he had taken a hit. Which is in line with Sanji not giving a shit for the entire rest of the fight, since anytime Lee lands any significant hit, he completely no-sells it. That includes the Hidden Lotus, which is one of Lee's strongest moves. Sanji doesn't care, and at this point neither do I. I remember being completely stone-faced the first time I saw this, but now I'm realizing the Sanji rundown and a few minor bits and pieces here and there in the fight are the only things keeping this out of my bottom 10 of all time. I hope One Piece gets another good episode someday, because I'd hate for their only modern representation on the show to be this.
He's a phantom.
Danny Phantom vs Jake Long is the second biggest disappointment of the season for me, only beaten out by Zuko vs Todoroki. Not because I'm overly attached to these characters or anything, I was just excited for more cartoons, and a lot of my friends love Danny Phantom as a show, so if this could get me more interested in checking it out like they've done for other series in the past, I would have been pretty happy. Guess what it did not do? The analysis here is so boring. Occasionally there will be a half-decent joke when they're not about Boomstick's ass, pointless references, and bad rapping, but unfortunately a lot of the jokes in this episode just so happen to revolve around Boomstick's ass, pointless references, and bad rapping. They also have two jokes in the cutaways where Boomstick uses the ghostly whale completely randomly, and also says he has thousands of rubber chickens. Both of them are just as funny as they sound. I guess I like Wiz saying they should go to the doctor as a way to make the ass jokes slightly less dire. The bit at the end of Danny's rundown about the dumb ways he loses his powers is alright, and I found Boomstick bringing up Jake's mother's poor choice in husband almost funny. That's really all I got. The rest of the analysis gives me nothing. It forgoes any kind of story or discussion of their personalities, and instead goes down the route of being more or less an audible respect thread. They go over their powers, read the calcs off, there we go, next segment. It feels like the writer either didn't care about the characters, or the more likely option given how Ben said he was actively going for shorter episodes and they already had their budget stretched thinner over 20 episodes instead of their usual 16. Lousy just wasn't able to write the analysis he wanted because of behind the scenes restrictions. I mean, compare this to Poe's analysis in season 8, where Lousy's script got to include story coverage and actually good jokes. There's a feeling of passion in that episode that just isn't present in this one, which again I'm sure was out of the writer's control. And the fight is a very mixed bag. I like most of it after they leave the museum, the clashing of their elemental powers, the chaos of the clone fight, the incredible hand-drawn shot of Jake's eye changing to Danny's once he gets possessed, and the way Danny's possession is used to make Jake slam himself into a bunch of buildings. This segment of the fight is really fun. What comes before and after, not so much. Everything in the museum sucks. I mean, I like the intentionally bad puns, but then we have the combat, which is the stiffest puppet rigging of the season. It's hard to believe the sprite team behind this part of the fight is the same as Miles vs Static, or hell, even the same team as the later portion of this fight. I'm glad it gets better, but the stiff posing and smears to cover the movements at the start just don't look good at all. I don't even think the choreography is bad, it just clearly suffered from budget and time restrictions. The sprite team is obviously talented, but they clearly didn't have the time they needed to fine-tune this one. The ending also sucks. Danny gets this awkwardly delivered, seemingly unfinished rap, vaporizes Jake with a random laser after his strongest move previously did nothing, and Jake is completely silent as he crumbles to dust and blows away. It gets points for Jake's ghost showing up at least, but even that feels like they rushed through it by having it show up before Jake's body has even finished fully disintegrating. All of this is with a backing track that doesn't do it for me. American Phantom isn't nearly as high energy as it should be for how hectic this fight gets. It's fine at setting a quieter atmosphere, but it does not fit a battle well. I think this is the one episode to not get a rap track that could have really used one. This is an episode I forced myself to like for so long, but I can't say that works anymore. Half of the fight is good, the other half and the analysis are all actively unfun, and the more I think about it, the sadder it makes me. I wanted to at least give it props for spawning the music from the Next Time trailer, but even that was part of Obi Wan vs Kakashi, so I guess that episode stays winning. Top 10 episodes carried by the track. Number 1, Grey vs. Azdeath. I fucking love Lost Ice Storms, but man, I have no reason to ever go back to this episode. The coverage of their stories and the analysis and whatever was cool. The jokes weren't hitting me at all though. At best, I was left completely stone-faced, and at worst, Boomstick was taking his shirt off and getting a stripper pole, and okay, you've lost me completely. The cutaway in Grey's wasn't even naturally brought about. You have them discussing the weird stripping shit, and then continue with the analysis for a bit, and then have Boomstick go, "Wait a minute, they take off clothes to get strong with?" Like, why wouldn't you cut to that earlier when you're actually discussing the thing it's related to? And then the fight, has its moments. The puppet rigging is aged way worse than I remember. Sometimes it's fine, but a lot of the times it looks stilted and stiff. The voices are not doing it for me either. It's not an issue with the impressions because I don't know how these characters are meant to sound, though based on the end clips and their rundowns, Grey is the only one who even sounds close to the character. But regardless of that, there are some deliveries that sound extremely off. Namely Grey shouting "she's too much," and as this "you have no right to feel my boot against your face" at the start. The action doesn't interest me too much either. The army battle is lame and they do nothing interesting with it. A lot of Grey's ice make magic has him in extremely stiff poses, and for characters that are meant to be genius strategists, they certainly don't show that off a lot here. Esdeath making a smaller shield to defend against the same attack she already failed to block earlier, forgetting how to move out of the way for some reason. Grey immediately going for the self-deleting move as soon as his Devil Slayer form is put at the slightest disadvantage. Esdeath going for the big storm after taking a single hit. These characters are portrayed less as strategists, and more as incredibly rash and kinda stupid, which contradicts how they described Esdeath and what they said about Grey's development. I can't go into specifics on how they should fight since that's Nem's area of expertise. I'll link a Season 7 retrospective in the description if you want to hear a reworking of the fight, but even as someone with no experience with these two, knowing we could have got a cool fight with a heavy emphasis on strategy and a lot of gacha moments, leaves me feeling kinda disappointed that we didn't really get anything that interesting. Throughout the entire fight I like a few bits of rigging, primarily on Esdeath. The bit where Esdeath drops the storm, and Grey's ice resistance letting him power through frozen time. Then Esdeath follows it up by throwing her frozen arm to stab Grey with a stupid face for an abrupt and boring kill. And again there's the track, which is a banger and I love it, but I can't say that alone gives me any reason to go back to this when I can just listen to it on its own. It tricked me into loving this episode for ages, but now, nah. In the past I've joked about doing a review of all the Death Battle cool-offs, which for those who don't know is just what my friend group calls the ice-themed episodes, but man I can't be bothered with a video where 2/3 of it is dedicated to an episode as boring as Sub-Zero vs Glacius, and one I find is generally unfun as this. Weiss vs Mitsuru is the best one, there you go. It's got the worst death, but the best, well, everything else really. I used to like Black Canary vs Sindel, not because I thought it was good, but because the amount of mileage my friends and I got out of bullying it gave me enough to enjoy ironically. Fast forward a year and no, this was super boring on a rewatch. Dinah's rundown had Boomstick making shitty puns which I found endearing, Sindel's had a cutaway that I liked the ending of even if the rest of it was bland as sin, and doesn't even make sense that Boomstick kept these skulls as souvenirs when Sub-Zero won his episode and they've never used Cabal. The conclusion was solid enough in terms of covering their bases and going into how decibels worked, but it also painted the match as a blatant uninteresting stomp, emphasis on uninteresting. The fight doesn't have much going for it either. The X-ray starts good, but then Dinah reacts more to the cracking of her leg than the shattering of her ribs. I like the lullaby interaction and how it flows, but I dislike almost every other line in the fight. About every line is delivered like the crew thought it was so much cooler than it actually was. Canary gets a bunch of quirky one-liners, which might be in character, but how should I know, her analysis barely covers that shit. A lot of this fight is boring hand-to-hand combat with very little that stands out. Whenever they scream I'm impressed that it isn't annoying, but it still isn't interesting. I like the lead up to the death with Sindel going for the throat and Canary using one of her scream bombs to get out of the bind, but then she recovers instantly and kills Sindel by punching her through the mouth, and it's super rushed and generally terrible. Speaking of generally terrible, there's the Sindel sprite. I don't like this weird massive hair that doesn't look anything like her. Her expressions never look natural. It just doesn't look good. Maybe I'd be able to look past that if she at least had an interesting dynamic with Canary, but again, the choreography is nothing, and outside of that one solid exchange, I do not like any of her lines. I wish I could still like this episode, at least in an ironic sense, but looking at the overall package of the episode, there are only like 3 lines in the entire thing I found ironically funny because of inside jokes with my friends. Those being Sindel's little monologue, Wiz talking about decibels scaling logarithmically, and Boomstick saying the funny not gonna lie Wiz line, which I only found funny because that episode came out right after that line had spiraled into a running thing in my friend group. Yes, the awful in-jokes are my main takeaway from this episode, because the rest of it is that uneventful.
How about this tree? Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah,
let's
looks
just
fine
do
to
it.
me.
All right, Pim, do you want to chop it down?
Wow, the first time we get 2 cartoon episodes back to back on this show, they both sucked. To be fair though, She-Ra vs Wonder Woman does fare a good bit better than Danny vs Jake, both in terms of the fight and the analysis. Namely She-Ra's for the latter. It does feel a bit more like a Versus wiki page than a full analysis on who She-Ra is, but they have at least some story stuff in the beginning and end, and it has enough decent jokes to where I wasn't bored out of my skull watching it. I even like the cutaway gag. The only part that was particularly weird to me was the bit where they go over swift wind speed, not because of what they say, but because of how the lines are delivered. See, when the pandemic first hit back in 2020, this was the final episode they recorded before they could no longer have Ben and Chad together to record in person. But the way this segment is delivered sounds like it was done last minute after lockdown had already started, and now they were no longer recording next to each other and didn't have things fully figured out yet. It's not a particularly glaring negative or anything, it's just something I noticed that interested me way more than anything in Wonder Woman's analysis. Okay, that's not entirely true. It did have Boomstick's reaction to the bracelets blocking Darkseid's Omega beams. That said, that's everything I get out of this. The rest of her rundown is bordering on the exact same as her Season 4 outing, with the only new thing of note they bring up being a number for the Shattered God feat. The rest of the jokes, and especially the cutaway, didn't do anything to help with that. At best I was bored, and at worst I was considering going back to give Danny vs Jake another shot. And the fight isn't devoid of good things. I think the sword fighting is very well animated. Everything has a good feeling of speed, and this long shot here is especially impressive. Too bad the rest of the battle is deathly uninteresting. It has a few cool bits here and there, like Diana cutting and tossing a tree, She-Ra tossing the invisible jet, and Diana using her magic redirection, and that's more or less everything. She-Ra blasting Wonder with her super breath decides to show the wind-up and aftermath of the attack, but not the actual impact for some reason. The death is so comically terrible and I can't take it seriously. The pillar getting caught is fine, but when it gets thrown they could have done with an obvious slow motion shot so it doesn't feel like the pillar's travelling super slowly for no reason in particular. I want to like She-Ra breaking the gauntlets because it syncs up to the fairly solid track, but the fact that this happened at all kinda broke my immersion in what was going on. Yeah, that's basically the entire fight. A couple pretty good moments, a couple really dumb and bad ones. The rest is really well animated, but I could not care less about what's going on. I think what really brings this episode down from one I'm neutral on to one I outright dislike is how they tackle the match in general. She-Ra's from an old and campy cartoon that they already used very effectively in He-Man vs. Lion-O. They got across the exact kind of tone I would have hoped for there. And with Wonder Woman they could have gone all in with the sillier, campier side of DC Comics and made a fight that's really tonally distinct from everything else in the season. Instead what we get is two personality vacuums, and the closest we get to any fun banter is Wonder Woman making a shitty pun. Hell, at the start she brags and then immediately after tells She-Ra to get over herself with no self-awareness. Well done. This episode's a weird one because I liked a lot of aspects more than I remembered, most notably She-Ra's entire analysis. I disliked the bad stuff more than I remembered, and it all averages out to an episode I like just about as much as I remembered. Which is to say I don't very much at all. It's not the worst Wonder Woman episode at least, but being better than Rogue vs. Wonder Woman is not an accomplishment to be proud of.
Azula's fire is also hotter than Zuko's. It's blue, one of the most popular colors of all time.
Zuko vs. Todoroki is the biggest disappointment of the season for me. Of all the episodes in Season 7, this is the one I was the most excited for. As a fan of My Hero Academia and someone with an interest in Atla despite having not seen it at the time, I was really interested to see how this match would go. So the analysis sucks. Todoroki's is mostly fine, Zuko's is not. The coverage of the story is good in both rundowns, starting with their tragic origins and ending with the figures that inspire them to stop caring about their fathers and fight for themselves. That's great. The rest of it though is mostly just summaries of their powers with some painful jokes thrown in. The cutaways are aggressively predictable, but those are small beans next to the obvious elephant in the room, Wiz simping over Zuko, who is 16 in most if not all of the footage they showed. Which I know the intent was for Genevieve to just make reference to her childhood crush on Zuko, but it did not come across well. The worst of it though is the Boomstick's dad jokes. This is the episode that made me hate them. The first one was fine, but then they crammed like 4 more in, and 3 of them are in Zuko's analysis. They ran the joke into the ground, which is rich coming from me, but even still I don't find them funny. I don't have as much of an issue with the lack of stats as most people do. Yeah, it does feel kinda bare bones, but they get across the general points they want to about how their powers would interact well enough. I'm not super thrilled about it or anything, but after other episodes before it felt like dry versus wiki pages, I am not as bothered as I otherwise would have been. And the fight is kind of not good. The choreography is really uninteresting. For the entire first half of the fight, I struggle to remember anything of note. I do remember the puppetry motion, which looked really bad most of the time. It uses a lot of smears in place of actually animating any dynamic motions, which I can only imagine is a result of limits in the budget and the time they had to work on the episode. The characterization animation's also not very well done. Zuko being awkward and unable to defuse the situation works. Shoto stumbling into a fireball and picking a fight before mentioning his dad really doesn't. Zuko also gets a bit worse later on, going on about his honor, and it made me realize, these two are both being plucked straight from season 1 before they're really satisfying character arcs, aren't they? Watching Atla and gaining a liking for Zuko as a character made this so much worse for me. They fight for a bit and eventually Shoto does the big glacier, which kinda confused me. So Zuko's sending this fireball down really close to Todoroki, but in this shot the fireball is coming from directly side on, further away than the glacier reached. It didn't seem right to me, and I didn't even realize Zuko was meant to be stuck inside the ice. Thankfully things do get a bit better from this point on. The rigging has less of those shitty looking smears, the previously solid track starts to really pick up with an incredible guitar solo and implementations of Yusei Run near the end, and we get the peak of this battle's hand-drawn stuff. No, not that one. What is up with his hand? I mean the shot of Todoroki's eye as he pushes himself to go beyond. It's a really minor shot, but it's so good. Even better than the he's just like me bit at the start, which I also really liked. We get the best of the effects here as well. Throughout the battle, the fire and ice effects are all really well done, but this shot here is just stunning in spite of Todoroki's kinda limp posing. It's followed up with a really cool death where Todoroki stabs Zuko, causes necrosis, and shatters him completely. Really good stuff. I also gotta mention the voice acting. John Van Doren does good as Todoroki, but Dante Basco crushes it as Zuko, obviously since he is his official voice actor. This episode has a lot of good stuff, but I can't say that I enjoyed it overall. For as good as the good stuff was, the bad stuff was just as prevalent in the fight. The combat was generally not very interesting, and the bad puppet rigging really let it down. And for every positive in the analysis, it has a boomstick dad joke to balance things out, and the other curse jokes which I can't say exactly fix things. Actually, it does end on a good note with Boomstick pondering what pun to make, and Wiz just being done with him. For what was one of my dream matches, this left me disappointed. Though it is the best of the first 3 Avatar episodes. And now that I've said that out loud, it's beginning to sink in. Oh my god.
For the last time, Parker, our pronouns are they, them.
Can I just say, right, Venom vs. Krona is a significant step up from Venom's previous episode, I'll give it that much. I mean, when talking about the fight anyway. Analysis-wise, they're about on even footing of just being kind of alright. In fact, I might actually like the one in Venom vs. Bane more for having jokes I remember liking, and much more clear and concise coverage of the character's stats. I don't care about quote-unquote objective accuracy, but I do at least care about them presenting their takes in ways that make sense. And they just don't do that for Venom vs. Krona. Speed is whatever, they don't give Venom the same speeds they did for Miles earlier in the season, but they do address similar feats for Soul Eater in the corner box. Though they also don't give Krona any attacking potency feats, and they kind of gloss over all of Venom's biggest stuff, which is kind of weird. Also, there's Kate's Venom, which is a whole other kind of worms that I refuse to touch. Other than that though, the coverage of their stories and them turning away from their villainous origins was pretty neat, and I like how Venom's analysis opens with the symbiote and then moves on to Eddie to shake things up from his first analysis where they did the opposite. And the fight sure did happen. It has its moments, I guess. I find the Venom FNAF jump scare really ironically funny, and I like the axe getting stopped by Krona's black blood. The rest of the combat is really slow and uninteresting, and I kinda just don't care. It never picks up. I thought it would after the axe, but instead we get this boring mid-air battle with awful sound design where nothing happens. And also Venom's wings are in a completely different sprite style to the rest of his body. The ending got me once again thinking things might pick up, with Krona appearing while Venom was blinking, and Venom getting a pretty cool last line. Then he stops and lets Krona instantly stomp him into the mud. Okay, cool, thanks. I like the Carnage vs. Lucy reference at least, both here and in the conclusion. Honestly, most of my compliments are towards Krona's side of things. I like how expressive their custom sprites are. Plus, I like Sarah Ann Williams' vocal performance. All those compliments go doubly for Ragnarok. I love John Van Doren's performance in spite of his lack of many lines in general, and his character animation's fantastic. I love how expressive he is with just his body language despite having no face. And I love when he does the soul vor at the end. On the topic of character animation actually, Krona actually kind of fits the weird janky puppet movements pretty well because of how they move in canon with Ragnarok yanking them around. Still doesn't mean these spinny smears don't look terrible though. Oh, and I guess for Venom's side, I like the Nightmare Before Christmas reference in the tongue thwip. That's also my favourite part of the track, which like American Phantom is another case of being good at setting atmosphere, but not something that fits a high-octane battle particularly well. Though the fight isn't that high-octane in the first place, so I guess it's fine. Besides those 2 lines for Venom I mentioned, I can't say I'm too into Adam Wennick's performance as him. The impression and a lot of the lines sound like they fit Carnage way more. And even then, he's nowhere near as entertaining as Carnage was against Lucy. Kinda makes me wish Carnage was the one to come back instead, but no, we needed Venom for the personality and interactions apparently. We can't get Carnage back, but we will just make Venom into him for a second time. I don't know, I wish Carnage got the run back instead, because I feel they could have gone way further with him than with Venom. Or, I don't know, use any of the other less boring Corona matches out with a half dozen or so potential options. Novel concept, not using a comic book character in Season 7, I know. Overall, this episode was just kinda boring. Not actively bad boring, just kinda bland and uneventful boring. I never hated watching it, but it didn't exactly change the game either. It was just kind of mid. I guess it gave me the slightest interest in checking out Soul Eater, so that's something, I guess. Corona 1 point, Venom 0 points.
Now I need to send some people to my incinerator?
I wish Genos vs. War Machine could have come out a year later. When it was announced, I had the same reaction as I did for Black Widow vs. Widowmaker and Poe vs. Iron Fist. Wow, I'm really excited to see them analyze this series and character that I love. Too bad they're being fed to a Marvel character I have no investment in. Whereas nowadays my reaction would have been, holy shit, One Punch Man vs. Don Cheadle? Literally my two favourite things on this earth. Anyway, so how was the episode beyond that? Well, when it first came out, I thought it was decent enough. Then after a rewatch, I absolutely loved it. Then over time I started to like it less and less, and oh boy, now we're right back to where we started. Genos analysis really lets me down. After how fun Mob vs. Tatsumaki's analysis was, Genos feels like the first big misstep for Season 7, focusing exclusively on the versus side of things with only bits and pieces of story here and there. Even Black Canary vs. Sindel had more extensive story coverage than this. And I know those characters have more established backstories than Genos does, but they still don't cover that many events in the show unless it is for the direct purpose of calquing it. Genos analysis I would compare to Tracer vs. Scout in a way. It's a really unremarkable and unmemorable analysis, but it is carried out of my love for the series they're talking about. Rhodey's rundown is actually quite a bit better, with a handful of jokes I like, while the Elon Musk bit that made me groan wasn't nearly as bad as More Thirsty Boomstick. I like the cutaway and the callback to Aquaman vs. Namor, and that's about it really. They also go over more story stuff and how his experience ultimately serves as a weakness given his PTSD, which I'm glad they did because Genos never got anything about his general inexperience and tendency to get his ass kicked. Also, there's a ton of Don Cheadle footage which obviously made me pop off. The fight is also decent. I'm not super into Genos or how he looks in this animation style, but Rhodey looks fine and Mark Allen Jr.'s performance has him sound close enough to Don Cheadle, so like 10 out of 10. As for what happens in the battle, there's a lot of good but a lot of bad as well. There's a lot of jank and a lot of parts where it doesn't look like the characters' attacks are making contact with each other. The rapid attacks especially look awful. This animation style does not suit them. You also get weird posings like Genos firing his first incineration cannon, and Rhodey staying completely motionless as he fires this barrage of rockets. I'm not too into Genos' dialogue either, even putting his performance aside. The ugly suit line doesn't feel like something he'd say, and it's not something I find that funny either. His ending line is terrible, and he says he won't fall apart that easily immediately after he had to pull himself together from Rhodey easily blasting him apart without issue. I mean, it could be worse. It could be Rhodey casually blocking his attack and zapping the life out of his eyes within seconds of the fight starting. For all the stuff Genos says though, he never once says incinerate, which is basically his catchphrase. A lot of my issues are at the start of the fight though. Not that it's all bad. I do like Rhodey's heads up display getting a read on Genos, and then him using that information to come up with a strategy, taking to the skies when he realizes Genos can't fly. But then things start to pick up quite a bit after the first incineration cannon. We get a lot more cool uses of strategy with Genos disabling Rhodey's flight, Rhodey going invisible now that his main method of outmaneuvering Genos is off the table, Genos realizing this and using his adhesive to keep Rhodey in place, and Rhodey using the ghost tech to survive the spiral incineration cannons. The effects for the lasers are also amazing. The colours stick out compared to the rest of the kind of drab look of the battle, especially when they clash. And of course there's the repulsor bitch slap, which is the most impactful hit of the fight on top of just being really funny. The death also starts pretty well with Rhodey leaving Genos no choice but to go for the self-destruct and taking him down with him. But then we get the quirky last scene where Genos acts overly edgy and Rhodey stomps on an already incapacitated head, and they've ruined it. For an episode that uses my favourite series ever, this leaves a lot to be desired. I still enjoyed myself, but I don't think there's any reason for me to revisit this over Mob vs. Tatsumaki or Saitama vs. Popeye.
The winner is the blue team.
One of the most popular...
So I'm not gonna pretend like Meta vs. Carolina is one of the best episodes of Death Battle. It's still a great episode, but it does make its target audience very clear, and those who don't like Red vs. Blue won't get as much out of it. Still, my sentimental attachment to that series and the domino effect the episode had on my life have made it an episode that has consistently been in my top 5 for years. So with me loving the previous Red vs. Blue Death Battle as much as I do, I was hoping this one would follow suit. It doesn't have to be one of the best episodes ever. I would have been fully content with another Black Widow vs. Widowmaker where I am very much in the minority when it comes to loving the episode. And I mean, I did like it, I guess, but it doesn't go anywhere beyond just liking it. Though it's not because it's a constant stream of mediocrity. The analysis is generally solid and fun, more so for the red team, only brought down by a lack of any jokes that I liked. The main ones that stuck with me were the Boomstick's dad jokes and Caboose being stronger than Goku. No, neither of those are in a positive light, and I shouldn't even have to clarify that. I enjoyed the analyses overall just because of how much I like Red vs. Blue as a series, but for a show based around comedy, their coverage isn't all that funny. Let's hope that's not a sign of what's to come later in the episode. So the fight then. It also has very few jokes that I liked. There was the occasional bit here and there like Donut's one-liner, Caboose saying Tucker did it at the end, and some of Sarge's lines are great despite him not having anyone to play off for the most part because Tex and Caboose never respond to him. It's not helped by some of the weakest overall voice acting in the series. Most of the Reds sound great, barring Griff, who's really poorly directed for most of his lines. About all I like out of him is his grunts of pain as Tex pushes his shit in. They sell him pushing through his pain and exhaustion to keep fighting a losing battle fairly well. Then the Blues just don't sound anything like themselves. I can excuse Caboose because his voice actor had to be replaced, and this was the first time Michael Malconian got to voice him properly. But I don't know why Bernie and Jason sound off as Church and Tucker. It's like they've been pitch shifted up and I don't understand why. Especially when Bernie also plays Lopez in this episode and he sounds fine. Though while we're on the topic of audio, I gotta bring up my favourite part of the episode, the track. Blood Gulch Bedlam is stellar. It's fun, bouncy, syncs up to the action well, basically everything I could want for a fight as chaotic as this. In fact, the episode is equally as pleasing on the eyes. It's got a great colour palette and the action is so well animated. There's no jank unless it's completely 100% intentional to either replicate the machinima style of the series or to aid with a joke. I might even go as far as to say this is the cleanest 3D episode of the season in that regard. I would have to assume the lack of facial expressions really helped the team here in regards to being able to put extra time into fine-tuning the movements, which they would need because this is the longest 3D animation of the season, almost clocking in at 5 minutes. I genuinely can't get over how good the hand-to-hand combat looks. Plus it's got good sound design. It does have a few dumb bits of choreography here and there, with Sarge matching Tex in strength despite him being unable to do that in canon, which they say in the analysis, Griff getting into a battle stance and then disappearing into the aether between shots, and Lopez getting hit to stop him from shooting Sarge before they even show him aiming at Sarge. I also can't say I'm too fond of most of the deaths. Lopez's is good, and it reduces him to just a head because, I mean, of course it does. Sheila's is okay, I guess. It sure is a reference. If only she got to talk or have any kind of presence in the slightest. Tex's was funny, but then the bullet takes out 3 other people and it just reeks of time restrictions. Griff's was fine, but had no real impact, and I can't say I'm too fond over Sarge being happy about it. Sarge's speech at the end was good, but his death was the most obvious shit ever after what happened at the beginning. And Simmons takes the title of my least favourite death of the season with how painfully unfunny it is. And it also means he doesn't even get to really do anything. Man, this episode let me down. In spite of being an obvious salt with a cannon winner, I still hoped it could have been something special to me, but it just isn't. It looks great, mostly sounds great, and it is a longer fight than we usually get. It succeeds in ways I never really expected it to, but at the same time it underutilizes almost all of its characters, and fails with the jokes and banter, the one area that I was really hoping they would excel with. I think this is a match that would have been way better suited for the SFM team. It would excuse any jank, and play more into the strengths of that team and their software with more opportunities for jokes and range combat. Then give Batgwen to this team and they could have made something actually coherent out of it. I could honestly see both of these episodes in the hands of the other 3D animation team cracking this season's top 5, and I don't get why they weren't swapped around. Whatever, this is still a good episode and I did enjoy it. Though outside of obviously having better rendering software, I don't think this even comes close to Meta vs. Carolina in most areas. The tracks are almost equally amazing to me and play into these matches' unique strengths better, but Meta vs. Carolina has a way more fun analysis, better action, a better kill than anything in this episode, and shockingly even better banter in a match where one of the characters is completely mute. That is a little bit sad.
You are monster?
I'm the devil, like from Bible. How have I not impressed that upon you yet?
Hulk vs. Broly is an episode that's kind of fallen off for me. I still really like it, don't get me wrong, and the gap between this and everything below it on the list is massive. But I think my initial love for it was hard carried by my first viewing being with friends, and the almost unanimous popping off we did over the devil line, the shot of the galaxy, and the reality-shattering headbutts, which are still great scenes, but those alone can't carry this into the top 5 anymore. Well, okay, there's a lot more to like than just those 3 scenes, but the episode's issues have bothered me a lot more as time's gone on. The models still don't look particularly great to me, Hulk especially. The start of the fight has so many bits that outright suck, from the hilarious shot of them standing in front of each other, to Broly's weak-ass punches, to this oddly framed slow motion shot, to the puny god bit, which just... What the hell, man. And throughout the entire battle, the sound effects are pretty bad. Almost nothing has the impact that it should. These two, above anyone else in this season, should feel like they hit like a freight train. You know, like Hulk's last episode, which is superior in just about every single way. There's also the issue of Broly's characterization, which doesn't bother me that much. I can buy him starting to slip out of his wrath state after Hulk dies from a decapitation, and if he has to scream anything during his blind fury, I can believe him saying that he'll kill Hulk. The delivery isn't selling me that much either way, but oh well. This episode has a lot of flaws holding it down, but for each of them there's a stunningly amazing moment that elevates it. The effects in this animation are all beautiful, from the 2D effects on Broly's eye and key, to the color distortion before the planet bust, to the insane reality break at the end. I like when they punch hard enough to create a huge vortex of wind. I love Hulk smashing the rock on Broly. I like Broly getting to use the paralysis move and then referencing Hulk's previous death. And there are some awesome shots of him shooting ki, like this rotating one here, and this bit after he goes Super Saiyan. The planet bust is neat even if the impact doesn't match Goku vs Superman or even Wario vs DDD. The shot of the galaxy being destroyed is stunning, and I can't think of anything else in the season that gave me a bigger adrenaline rush than my first viewing of the reality-shattering headbutts. None of those are my favourite part of the fight though. My favourite is a line from Hulk right before these weird rapid punches and right after the shitty looking green door. I thought Broly getting to use Hulk's catchphrase was kinda neat, but the way Hulk works in Broly's "I'm the Devil" line, which is also a reference to the recent Devil Hulk comic run, it's one of my favourite lines in the series, and the delivery is perfect. This entire battle is also coupled with a very solid track. Ikari is a banger. It's probably not as heavy as it should be, but I don't care, I still love it. Somehow it has some really calm portions that still manage to fit their scenes, and I respect the hell out of Werewolf and Daniel Vincent Galvin for making it work. I've listened to it quite a few times, it's great. I also like the analysis. Hulk started out kinda boring, but as soon as we start getting to the different Hulk personalities and Bruce's more recent story arcs, I'm hooked. Broly's was really fun as well. I especially like how they transition into talking about him unlocking Super Saiyan. I like this episode quite a lot, and I don't want the amount of time I spent going over its flaws to take away from that. I wish I could go more in depth with my favourite shots and scenes, but there isn't much more for me to say other than it's cool. I wish it didn't have those issues, namely with a shoddy start and weak overall sound design. Then I could have maybe placed it even higher. But as it is, it's still yet another good Dragon Ball death battle, and yet another hit for the season finales.
Inside you, there are two wolves.
Saberwolf vs. John Talbane is a really good episode. After a lot of the season got better on a rewatch for me, I was super excited to revisit this one, but it turns out this is the episode where my opinion on it has changed the absolute least. Despite me having generally less stakes in the analysis back when I first watched it, I remember liking it back then, and I still like it now. The jokes are generally solid, including one of my favourite boomstick end puns, and the dive into their stories and the kinds of werewolves they are was really interesting to listen to. I like how it comes into play in their conclusion as well, with John's extra control being a reason to support his victory, even if it wasn't exactly the most crucial point they brought up. It's not one of my favourite episodes analysis-wise, but it's still very good. The passion for old-school fighting games really shines through in the script. About the only issue I have with it is Saberwolf's rundown ending a little abruptly, and the conclusion giving John nothing for attacking potency. I don't mind them not putting a number on his speed because the gap is already clearly wide enough, but them only going into lifting strength feats for him leaves it feeling a little incomplete. All my big issues with the episode come from the fight. A lot of it's really slow, and it has sound design barely one step away from the Zero vs Metal Sonic tier of awful. Somehow it is outdone by Beast vs Goliath in terms of showing two feral monsters clawing into each other, since that one is generally faster and has way more fitting sound effects over their slashes. This episode I genuinely could not tell when John was using his nunchucks, because they make the same sound as his claws. Those two issues persist throughout the entire animation and really bring it down from being something special, because basically everything else is great. I like Brendan Blaber's performance as John well enough, but Chris Guerrero does amazingly as Saberwolf. It's not a performance on the same tier as when he did Carnage back in season 5, I mean few performances are in general, but he sells Saberwolf's fear of himself and the lines where he's become a feral monster really well. It totally makes up for how these Saberwolf sprites look, because they are, not good. This doesn't look like any Saberwolf I've ever seen. This is just a random werewolf in green trousers. There are some really cool shots in the fight. I like the shot where they're fighting in the wall, I like how the fire on the ground is used to Chekhov's gun for the fire bats, the fire dragon summon's pretty cool, and the animation is just generally solid in spite of the disappointingly slow pace. pace. Not that the speed is what kills it completely, because there is some dumb stuff regardless. I can't say I'm a fan of the setup where John transforms with no sound effect and refuses to help Sabrewolf out of the same spot that he'd been in before. If Sabrewolf was the aggressor and not the one begging for forgiveness, then that'd make sense, but John is meant to be the one with control. And as good as the corpses are for setting atmosphere, this hand-drawn one doesn't look too great. And also Sabrewolf tries to block the fire dragon with one, gets knocked into a different position, and then sticks his arm back out for some reason. I like the idea of Sabrewolf going for a defensive strategy that doesn't work because he isn't as smart in his current state, but the way it's animated is a little weird, and they picked a fine time to pick the pace up and start speedrunning things by not giving it any time to sink in. After they burst through the wall though, yeah, this part of the fight is outstanding if you ignore the wet towel slap sound effects. They're finally picking up the pace, going for the kind of speed and ferocity I was hoping they'd have from the beginning, and then we get this scene of Sabrewolf ripping out John's intestines and strangling him with them. That's one of the best implementations of gore in this series. It's creative, and above all else, it's fucking vicious. This leads into the borderline perfect ending where the blood moon goes away, John regains control and uses his greater intelligence to come up with a strategy to get out of the bind he's in by nuking the both of them. This leads into the final scene with an incredible looking monochrome color palette, and only the dark red blood being colored as the blood moon comes back out and John loses control again. I've heard people say this goes against their conclusion, since they did say John won because of his control, whereas in the fight he goes full feral, but like, no. John wins because of the fire dragon that he had to strategize to use. Sabrewolf had already lost by this point, and with the blood moon coming back out, it means we get this nasty kill without it being out of character. Not only is it gloriously bloody, but Sabrewolf trying desperately to hold on to the gravestone, and his less feral scream as his head gets ripped off, giving the impression that it's the last of his humanity crying out as his head is ripped from his shoulders. Good god, I don't have the words to describe it. This is the best kill of the season, hands down. Cable's death is in the same general tier because of how creative it is and how funny I find it, but man, compared to everything else this season, this is in a league of its own. The track also complements the fight very nicely. I'm not as into it as most other people seem to be, but I do love the chorus. If this fight had better sound design and faster paced combat, I could totally see this climbing up to the top 5. Hell, if the entire thing was as good as the ending, then I could see it taking the top spot. It might not have for me, but I've seen plenty of others call this their favourite of the season. I still really enjoyed it. It's definitely weaker than the Halloween episodes surrounding it though.
It's got 8 legs! That's like 4 times.
Miles vs. Static is an episode I was sure I was gonna like less on a rewatch. The puppet rigging's the best thing it has going for it, but now it's not even the best episode in that field since Season 8 improved upon the foundation that it laid out. So what else could this episode even have to help it stand out? Well, for one, it's just one of the visually nicest sprite fights of the season. The Spider-Verse inspired look for some of these shots look incredible, and the setting being nighttime lets the glow of their lightning look much more vibrant. This fight does a great job at making the bright colours pop, and I'm here for it. The choreography and character animation are on point as well. Miles gets to take the lead when they're throwing hands to reflect his greater strength, but Static is able to use his wide variety of powers to hold his own and directly counter Miles. Miles is sticking to a wall, Static makes him slip off. Miles goes invisible, Static makes his aura glow. Miles is fast enough to dodge his attacks, Static holds him in one place. At the end, Static even figures out Miles' web shooters and electric powers, so he shorts out the former and uses his plasma coil to insulate the latter. For a match I didn't think I'd find too interesting, their arsenals and abilities bounce off each other surprisingly well. It's not like it's a one-sided beatdown either, because Miles is still able to keep up with his raw strength and intelligence, even taking out Static's main method of getting around and cutting his arm off briefly. I also like the bit where Miles is falling and he has to shoot his webs onto the top part of the building to save himself. You gotta love the reference to the best scene in Spider-Verse. There isn't really a whole lot weighing this fight down. It does have a few issues, but very rarely do I look at a shot in it and think it's bad. The death is fairly uninteresting despite the cool build-up. The shot of Miles bumping into Static kinda confused me since I'm not exactly sure what's meant to be happening. Is this Static pulling him in with his magnet powers? Even then, Miles was already going towards him, so I'm not sure what's meant to be hitting him. And there are some points where they're not fighting that feel a little slow and low energy, but it's never too bad. The analysis holds up better than I expected as well. Despite having a fairly rough start to the new Wiz and Boomstick designs which would later be ironed out, I found the rundowns for both characters fun and informative with a few good jokes every so often and a neat little tangent about Static's introduction to the DC universe. It also spawned plenty of memes in my friend group, like Miles' really dumb end clip that mixes audio and visuals from 2 different scenes, Electro getting shat on in the conclusion, the whole too much Spider Spider-Verse footage bit, which, okay, yeah, I love that movie, but maybe there was a bit too much focus on it for a Comic Miles analysis. And, well, everything to do with Professor Boomstickium. Bit aside, I think this is a funny enough cutaway gag. I'm so glad this premiere held up on a rewatch is one that I love. I don't talk about it a whole lot, but it's one of the better Marvel vs. DC fights as a whole. Not to mention the best premiere with that pair by a landslide.
Okay, you're strong, but are you fast enough?
Flash vs. Sonic is a great episode, though it did kinda let me down a little. A match like this is one I feel should absolutely be booked for a season finale. That way more budget and time can be put into it to do as much as you possibly can with the match, because this being thrown into some random spot in the middle of the season means that it doesn't get nearly as much time dedicated towards it as it probably needed. Both of these two have so many reality bending abilities that could have been interesting to see. Their methods of BFR and resurrection, Ultrasonic trying to manipulate the matter in Wally's body, but he's able to control his own molecules to resist it, you know, that kind of thing. But we didn't get a whole lot of that. There is one short instance of dimensional travel, and Wally did do the energy prism thing, but nothing else in this really taps into the full potential of how over the top they can get. And even with what they do include, it feels like some of it was cut short, like Supersonic only being on screen for about 20 seconds, and the dimensional travel only being a single short scene that ultimately amounts to nothing. This is one of the big 3 DC fights with the most untapped potential, only beaten out by Thanos vs. Darkseid and Doctor Strange vs. Dr. Fate. Though this one still isn't as bad in that regard as either of those two, because this one at least has some interesting stuff going on in the animation, and you know, unlike those two episodes, I actually really love this one. I mean, obviously if I've ranked it this highly. While it doesn't go all in with their crazier powers, it does still use enough of them to keep the fight entertaining, and on top of that, it's got good conveyance of the character speed from beginning to end. Not quite as good as the other Flash episodes because of the lack of identifiable set pieces, but the fact that they did as well as they did despite that hindrance is pretty impressive. I'm not going to say the locales entirely hold the episode back though, because the bonus zone and the cosmic interstate both look great, and they make for much more unique and memorable set pieces than a lot of other fights this season. I'm not exactly going to remember the 50th use of random abandoned city. On top of great effects, some really stunning hand-drawn shots, and the lack of the typical season 7 sprite jank, there's not really anything holding the fight down in the visual department. Same goes for the audio, mostly. I love the track, and hearing it work in some iconic Sonic melodies was awesome. Joshua Waters generally does good as Wally, and Nicholas Andrew Louis does great as Sonic. Even getting a deeper voice as Ultrasonic, which I hear is an actual thing in the Archie comics. The fact that they even worked that small detailing goes to show how much they cared about getting him right. Unfortunately, the one line he does get as Ultrasonic is kinda terrible and not directed very well. It lets me down even more considering they just don't have the two interact after the preview ends. Their banter at the start was very entertaining, but after that they just stopped. And considering how vibrant their personalities are, I wish we could have seen them bounce off each other more. Still, that's another showing of how most of my issues with the animation come down to just them not being able to go all out, rather than anything being done particularly badly. And also the ending is kinda weird. Sonic uses the laser, which Flash is not pushed back by at all. He goes unmoored, which is really confusing because they never actually elaborated on what that was in the analysis and how it would turn him into Ghost Rider or whatever. And for Flash's final attack, we never get to see or hear the initial impact of it landing on Sonic. He shatters the emeralds, then the screen glows and his hand is already on Sonic with no sound effect for the attack landing, and then Sonic is apparently meant to be reliving his whole life before he's shattered across dimensions or whatever. It's super confusing and not well conveyed at all, to the point where they had to go out and explain it on the Death Battle cast. That said, I still love the ending in spite of those problems, because even if it's kinda confusing, we get a lot of amazing hand-drawn stuff. Sonic's Death Scream is one of the best in the series, the various pieces of his history being shown as he gets destroyed are really cool, and I've come to really like Flash's last line. There's no quirky one-liner, he doesn't disrespect his opponent, he was just so taken aback by the fight that he's left speechless. Yeah, and the analysis is good too whenever they're not having Boomstick talk about NARBs or whatever. It was our first real taste of how they would move on to use comic panels in their editing, and it's all very well done. I also like most of the jokes, and we get a good blend of story and character stuff as well as versus stuff. Though the conclusion is a lot more bare bones than what it should be given the match in question, but it covers the basics well enough, I guess. I forgot to write a final line for this one, but yeah, good episode, I like it.
This part is so good, I hate it.
Well, it finally happened. As much as it pains me to admit, I have fully come around to Cable vs. Booster Gold. I saw it as just decent for so long, but on my latest rewatch, I kind of loved it. The fight isn't the most interesting in the world in terms of choreography. I mean, it has some fun uses of their tech, like the time stop, the T-Rex controller, and everything that follows it, though that's not exactly the episode's strongest suit. It's still fun and has a lot of memorable moments, but the focus of the fight is with the dynamic between Cable and Booster's personalities. This plays out similarly to Deadpool vs Deathstroke, where we have a goofball bouncing surprisingly well off a gritty serious character, and it leads to plenty of fun exchanges which are even funnier thanks to the solid voice acting. Neither of them stand out as some of my favourites, but they're both still good. Rico Fajardo as Booster, you can tell especially was having the time of his life with the role. He brings a lot of charisma to the table, and it lets Booster's eccentric personality stick with me. As I said before, the actual fighting isn't exceptionally amazing or anything, but it's still solid. The time stop has a funny payoff. Cable launching Booster into a million next weeks is great, as is the line following it. I like Cable using his own force field and him taking advantage of the environment with his telekinesis is neat. They work in his dinosaur controlling devices, which I like, even if the dinosaur itself kinda looks terrible and clashes horribly with everything else on screen. And everything that follows Booster getting picked up by the T-Rex is iconic. The superior time husk scene, the army of boosters, the smug delivery of all of Booster's lines at the end, the creative and unique death where Cable gives him one last middle finger before being taken out, the facial expressions on Booster throughout all of it, it's kind of phenomenal. The animation doesn't have too much I can say I particularly dislike. I used to find it weird that Booster had a deeper voice than Cable, but now it kinda makes sense in retrospect. All of my issues really come down to some visual shortcomings. Booster also has very limited sprites, and it kinda shows with a lack of in-betweens for a good few of his movements, and how a lot of his animations have him in much more static poses than Cable and other sprite fights in the same style. I also enjoyed the analysis, like, to a shocking degree. It had a lot of jokes I laughed at on both ends, and it made me respect the characters so much more. Which, for Cable, I didn't know him outside of Deadpool 2, but his analysis gave me a decent handle on his story and what he's like. Plus, him rewriting his own DNA strand by strand is the biggest power move I have ever seen. So Cable seems neat, but what surprised me more is how I ended up feeling about Booster afterwards. I went in knowing basically nothing about him. He was a D-list character from a series I was burned out on seeing, and from what I'd gathered he was essentially one big shitpost. So I went in with a predetermined bias against him. But this episode changed my perception of him. As much as they say he's full of shit throughout, the way they talk about his story at the end and how he went from starting as a hero solely for selfish reasons, to then eventually turning down a position at the Justice League and saving people without getting credit as to not disrupt the flow of time, it made me respect his character quite a bit. Other episodes have made me like characters more before, even ones I had no experience with like Dracula or Sam Fisher, but none of them have ever had the same uphill battle as this one did. And while it didn't have me actively rooting for Booster to win, it still made me leave the episode with a newfound respect for him, and I can appreciate that. Man, for a season that was kinda infamous for ignoring characters and stories in favor of versus stuff, this one was shockingly well done. I wonder why that checks out. I can't believe I'm saying it, but I really loved this episode. That's what we call character development. You hate to see it.
And Michelangelo? Well, we all know he got dropped as a kid.
That's right, Boomstick.
Leonardo vs. Red Ranger is easily the best of Leo's 3 episodes, though given his first is barely scraping by is decent with how they bully Michelangelo, and his second episode is one of the most forgettable in the series, I would have been a bit sad if this didn't surpass them by a country mile. The analysis here is way better than I remember, and way better than the obnoxious sound effects of Boomstick eating cereal in the intro were making me think it'd be. I didn't find it particularly funny, outside of the cutaway and Jason segment, not because it's a super well thought out joke or anything. I just like how Ben's scream and Chad's line at the end are delivered. The rest of the analysis is really enjoyable. The jokes weren't hitting me mostly, but I liked hearing them go over these characters and their histories with that upbeat music in the background. The one in Jason's analysis especially stands out, and the fight is faring even better. Much like Miles vs. Static, I like how all the action flows. Jason can't immediately morph because of the rules in his universe saying how he can't escalate a fight with unnecessary weapons, so him taking on Leo in his regular human state initially makes sense. Then he morbs, takes Leo on in a sword fight, uses his gun when Leo's out of reach, and creates an opening with a big T-Rex move to get a good stab in on Leo's arm. But Leo gets to do plenty of cool shit too, including using his healing hands and Odachi to bring in some unique equipment, weaponizing a manhole cover when he's disarmed, and I love the entire sequence of him teleporting around while Jason shoots at him, then using his shell to deflect a laser and slam into him. That's dumb as hell in the best way and easily my favourite part of the fight. That last bit also plays into this fight's generally fun 80s feel, in a similar way to Optimus vs. Gundam, but much lighter in tone. The cheesy dialogue and retro music add to that feeling, as well as making it in general a really fun fight. And while the rigging in this episode isn't as prominent as in Miles vs. Static, I think it looks just as smooth and natural when it is used. In the way of negatives, there's basically nothing to go over. Even if it isn't hitting the same amazing peaks as other episodes, there's still very little I outright dislike here. Leo eating a pizza out in the open's kinda dumb, Leo's characterized closer to how I'd see Michelangelo acting, who they once again shit on in the analysis for some reason, the Odachi looks no different to his regular swords, and no, that's about it. I guess it might be held back a little by being on the shorter side, much more so than Shredder vs Silver Samurai. More time for them to fight and for Leo to bring out some other weapons when he lost his sword could have been cool, but what we got was still great in spite of the short runtime. It's not an episode I have particularly much to say about, but I enjoyed it quite a bit. Considering how I wasn't a fan of Nightwing vs Daredevil at all, I am so happy I liked the next live action fight as much as I did. On paper, Red Hood vs Winter Soldier isn't too much more interesting. It has more weaponry and such to work with, but the only ones that could feasibly be included were the guns, tasers, and knives, because I was not expecting them to bust out the blades within Bucky's metal arm, any swords, or god forbid a flamethrower in live action. But somehow they pulled this off extremely well. In a way, this episode reminds me a lot of Ryu vs Scorpion. The martial arts combat throughout the entire fight is fantastic, and their special moves are worked in very well, though for this one it's their various weaponry and tactics as opposed to any supernatural powers. Red Hood gets to have several moments to show off his greater stealth since he's the only one that ever has the other searching for him, and while they're skilled enough to keep up with each other, Bucky's metal arm and infinity formula do give him the physical edge whenever they trade blows. Jason is never completely and utterly outmatched, but Bucky does still have the edge until Jason brings out the venom, which again reminds me of the incorporation of Evil Ryu into Ryu vs Scorpion with how Jason's able to outmuscle Bucky and tank his hits way better until Bucky regains the upper hand in the end. In fact, beyond the Ryu vs Scorpion comparisons, this episode reminds me of Season 2 in general thanks in no small part to the insanely long fight scene. It clocks in at around 6 minutes, which is unheard of for recent death battles. That gives it plenty of time to set up the fight and have breathing room between all the action without having to sacrifice anything. Unlike a lot of the rest of the season, this one never feels like they have to speedrun through anything. Well, until the ending that is, because the Ryu vs Scorpion comparison keeps going until the very end where the death is terrible. It's abrupt, obviously limited by the live action style of the animation, it's just generally not very good at all. And the conclusion is similarly not all there. Since they don't bring up stats, they don't give much of a compelling case for why Red Hood can't just sneak up on Bucky and shoot him if he can evade even Kryptonian senses. They also have another golden tree situation with Jason breaking Supergirl's grip, and they say that Jason's cowl broke because of a knife, while showing him saying that his helmet shouldn't be able to be broken by a knife. I'm not saying their conclusion was wrong by any means. I'm sure stats were discussed behind the scenes and were just left out for the sake of the casual audience, but in doing so it means they didn't put together a very good explanation. So all in all, this is a great fight with plenty of standout moments, my favourite of which being the Jason PTSD scene. I'm really impressed with how that was worked in. I wouldn't listen to the background score on its own, but it's good in the context of the battle, and somehow I haven't mentioned the stellar costume design up until now. Bucky's costume's pretty good. I couldn't even tell that his arm was CGI until he had to fix it because that looked kinda weird. But Red Hood steals the show here. That cowl looks so good, where can I get one of those? I also like the attention to detail with their battle damage as the fight goes on. Like, Jason's glove gets burned by the gun self-destructing, which is such a small thing for a shot that lasts maybe a second, but they did it anyway because this episode is a labour of love and it's incredible. I've compared this a lot to Ryu vs Scorpion, and I would say it's very similar in quality. The death is worse, but the conclusion isn't quite as god-awful, and the rest of their fights are a similar level of excellence. While they excel in different areas, there are still only minor issues here and there. What shoots Ryu vs Scorpion a little bit ahead for me though is the analysis. That one was really fun all throughout, whereas this one had good story coverage and such, but I was left completely stone-faced outside of the Red Hood cutaway gag, which was great, and the Bucky end clip, which is so ironically funny because he's not even the focus of it. The editing is better in this episode for sure though. Flash vs Sonic was our first taste of them editing with a heavy emphasis on making comics visually interesting, rather than the static PNGs we were used to. Then this episode was Nick just starting to experiment with how crazy he would get with them later down the line. It's not up to Season 8's level in that regard, but it's still very well edited. This segment's been kind of all over the place, but leave me alone, the low points of the season have melted my brain, and a match as mind-bending as Flash vs Sonic happening directly before this did not help.
But how can you stop me if you don't exist?
Despite currently not existing, Beerus vs Galaxy is an episode that will always hold a special place in my heart. I mean, it was the first one I ever took part in one of those Discord watch parties with my friends for. Though I wouldn't say I love it quite as much as on my first viewing, it was still an incredible way to bring the season back from its break. The jokes and the analysis are kind of a mixed bag. There are plenty of ones I found funny, and plenty that I didn't. Though I'd say I liked the good jokes more than I disliked the bad ones. Dummy's introduction was pretty good too. On top of that, we get good coverage of my boy Beerus in an unfortunately short but still very very fun rundown. And Galaxia's gets an extended opening where Wiz goes through Sailor Moon lore, and it almost got me interested in checking out the series. In fact, I'd say Galaxia's analysis I might have enjoyed more overall since there was more story to go into with her. And man, I love the fight. It has its issues, mainly on Galaxia's side with her lower quality sprites and kinda janky puppet motions at times, though Beerus isn't free from his own wonky visuals, namely the supposedly traced hand-drawn thing at the end, and the lip flaps being unable to look natural in this animation style. They might have even realised that themselves, which is why some shots of them talking don't have either of them moving their mouths at all. Other than those minor grievances, this is a thrill ride. It's got all the fast-paced action I'd want from a Dragon Ball fight, and while it doesn't go as far with the destruction as I would have hoped, it still goes to a grander cosmic scale than most other episodes, and every celestial body that blows up has the impact that it should. The fight is really well choreographed, giving Galaxia plenty of opportunities to keep Beerus at bay with her wider range of powers, but Beerus is able to keep up with his raw strength and speed alone. The poking battle at the start also got a chuckle out of me, as did Beerus' line before getting thrown by the tail, as did the contrast in how they interacted with the planets that they landed on, as did the ending. I could probably just say the jokes in the fight all land and that'd get my point across quicker. The Hakai clash at the start looks really pretty, the fight within the sun and their big energy orbs clashing is awesome, I love Beerus using Ultra Instinct, and the entire finale is breathtaking. The animation had gotten the jokes right previously, but this is the shining example of how it can do just as well with the serious parts. The fake out genuinely got me on my first viewing, and I will never forget the pop-off my friends and I all had when we heard Beerus' "I am the impossible" line. I like Blythe Renee as Galaxia, but River Canoff is on another level with how well he portrays Beerus, and this line is the single best delivery in the episodes. Dragon Ball's a franchise that's been very consistently good on Death Battle, and while this isn't even in my top 3 of those anymore, I'm glad it got another masterpiece to keep the record going strong. Here's hoping they can do the same with the next Sailor Moon episodes. You know, assuming they haven't been put off doing another one because of the copyright hell this episode put them through. Finally, a banger episode for a Pokemon that isn't Charizard. Goro vs Machamp is an incredible episode. Not for any one specific scene or any incredible writing qualities, it's just really, really fun. I've previously called this episode Machamp featuring Goro a lot. Not because the episode does a particularly poor job at giving Goro cool stuff to do, Machamp is just that entertaining. It's responsible for most of my favourite parts of the battle, and while I don't think Goro was bad by any means, he is responsible for a good few of my issues with it. Let's start with the analysis. I really like Machamps. It's like an actually good version of what Lucario vs Renamon was going for with the nature documentary style. It didn't have any jokes or anything that particularly stuck with me, but I was still entertained. Seeing all the different footage from various Pokemon media, them talking about Machamp's entire evolution line, what the species is like, its role in the Pokemon world, I don't know, it just made me happy, it put a smile on my face. Goro's was also there. I still enjoyed it because I like Goro when he isn't being portrayed as a little jobber bitch. For a character with not a whole lot of story to go over, they still go over it decently enough. While I appreciate this giving Goro feats and scaling that hasn't been brought up before or since, it also reuses all of the repeated scaling that makes Mortal Kombat rundowns less interesting to me, because it is the most repetitive shit this side of the Naruto moonhole. Raiden's big explosion, scaling to Cabal despite him being way faster than everyone else and also never even meeting him, even test your might in the sidebar. It's not even just the versus stuff, it's the jokes as well. The Mortal Kombat theme song and pointing out how they spell things with a K can be funny, but the same joke gets old after a point. Plenty of other Mortal Kombat episodes have selections of stuff from that list, but this is the only episode to my knowledge that crams all of them in, and it's for a super short analysis too. So Machamp's analysis steals the show compared to Goro's, and the fight is no different. Even not getting into what actually happens in the fight, the difference becomes clear as soon as they both show up on screen and start speaking. Goro's model I can't say I'm a fan of, and his voice performance is good if nothing noteworthy. Machamp's model though is so well made that I genuinely thought it was ripped straight from Pokken. And Keston Howard's voice performance is insanely good. This is my favourite of his performances, which should say a lot given how much I love Yoda vs King Mickey and how spot on his Mickey voice was. What makes this performance surpass that one for me is the fact that he managed to get so much range out of his lines and put so much personality into the character, despite only being able to say a single word in different ways. And then the actual fighting, well, there's not really much to say. It's all super fast paced outside of this one kindness a little bit, and it's a ton of fun with plenty of standout bits. The seismic toss, the X-ray, Machamp activating guts while powering through the fire breath, the rock smash cross chop combo, the back and forth at the end, them powering through losing an arm due to sheer adrenaline, and that banger of a death. It's all so good. Forfeit's Death Punch is an amazing track as well. I mean, it mixes Pokemon or Mortal Kombat music together, it was bound to be good. It's got a fittingly high level of energy and gets stuck in my head constantly. The few things here and there that bother me are all incredibly minor. Goro's line here starts good, but then he pulls a Sanji and keeps going. The body chunks flying away at the end looks sillier than I think was intended, and it does kinda hold the death back a little. As cool as them keeping going after being disarmed through sheer adrenaline was, I wish they at least reacted in pain and powered through it, rather than just not giving a shit. Also, Machamp dabs I hate it here. This episode is such a blast to watch. It's an adrenaline rush with plenty of funny jokes sprinkled into the fight on top of the stellar action. Hell, this episode even made me like Machamp more. It went from a Pokemon I never thought about to one of my favourites from Gen 1. This is easily among the best episodes either of these series ever got, and it remains by far one of the season's highlights.
Rewrite the Star Wars prequels!
Obi-Wan vs Kakashi has remained at the top of my ranking ever since it came out. I can't say it's quite top 5 of the show anymore for me, but man, I still love this episode to death. The analyses are some of my favourite this season. Obi-Wan starting with Old Ben in A New Hope, then going back to the prequel era stuff just like the actual release order for Star Wars is great. And I like learning about the Legends canon of Star Wars, which I was not familiar with in the slightest beforehand. I also like how his story and abilities are interwoven. After they go over the early events of his life up until Phantom Menace, they discuss his basic abilities, then move on to his time as a general where they start getting into feats, then only bring up a calc near the end, scaling him to Anakin after going over how his greatest failure was losing Anakin to the dark side. I love the ending to the analysis as well, going over his final battle and how he opened the floodgates for the future generation, just like All Might vs Might guy. And I'll never not crack up at the whole high ground tangent. Kakashi's is similarly great. I was told this was the main thing that lets the episode down, but I could only assume that's from the stat side of things, which I don't care about. Kakashi's abilities and such were interesting to learn about, but I found his story even more so. His entire life being tragedy after tragedy made me feel really sorry for him, and showing off all the cool stuff he did in spite of that made me instantly like him, despite me having never seen any piece of Naruto media. And the fight is something else, man. This was our first taste of what the SFM team could do with Star Wars, and it is incredible. To get my issues out of the way at the start, I don't like this scene where Kakashi spins around the tree and they flash the lightsaber to Kunai in the air. It's really janky, honestly had me confused about what was happening for so long, and it is visually a huge downgrade from the previous scenes. Earlier the fight had way nicer looking lighting, with the characters moving a lot more fluidly and just generally looking better. Here the lighting is way flatter and the models look kinda lifeless. That's it, that's all my major problems, a singular short scene. Every other issue I previously had is either really minor or makes sense in context. Oh, I thought this Kakashi line was delivered kinda weird? Well, it's grown on me a bit. And also I'm told this is accurate to how he speaks anyway. Obi-Wan is going on the aggressive when they explicitly say he's a master of a more defensive lightsaber combat style. Well, against Kakashi who spends a lot of the fight evading and fighting from a distance with his various jutsus, it makes enough sense. The one-stroke duel at the end doesn't last long enough? Well, yeah, it could have lasted a bit longer and Obi-Wan could have been posed better, but the build-up, aftermath, and still decent timing make this a really great finisher that I would rank even higher if I were to redo my death tier list nowadays. Those extra improvements would have just shot it even higher, probably even to where it could have been on par with Ryu vs Strider. The rest of the fight is phenomenal. It doesn't use all or even most of their jutsus and force powers, but it uses enough to keep the choreography interesting, and Kakashi gets to use his most important stuff, like the Kamui and the purple Chidori thing. The effects are great across the board, the models mesh together pretty well, and I like both characters' voice performances. Kakashi took me off guard initially because I never knew that's how he was supposed to sound, but Nicholas Andrew Louis does a really good job as far as I can tell. The real star of the show here though is Stephen Kelly as Obi-Wan Kenobi, not only for the line deliveries, which by the way are all more or less perfect, but for the lines themselves. See, when this got announced, I thought, man, it'd be funny if Obi-Wan talked exclusively in prequel quotes. I mean, they'd never do that, I'm only expecting a few at most, but it'd be funny. Nah, they went all in and made him talk almost exclusively in prequel memes, outside of the two serious scenes, which I will get to. What's more impressive to me though, is that if you're in on the joke like I am, then you'd obviously get what they're going for, but if you know nothing about Obi-Wan or the prequels, then they come across so naturally that it could probably be mistaken for normal dialogue, and some people might never know that they're even trying to reference anything. I fall into the former group, and I just really like prequel memes because I've never been overly exposed to any of the shit ones. So I was having a blast with the fight because of them, but then they blindsided me with this, my favourite scene that Season 7 has to offer. It sets the atmosphere flawlessly for a really intense scene that gives us some of the best visual storytelling Death Battle has ever done, and I would not be the least bit surprised if it wasn't even fully intentional. I'm told Genjutsu can mess with your perception of time and even give you glimpses into the future, the latter of which the Force can also do, so it would make sense for the jutsu that messes with your senses to be able to amplify that. And this being Vader in a state that Obi-Wan wouldn't meet until he was Old Ben means that this is exactly what it's doing to him here, but he calms himself, collects his thoughts, and breaks out. What follows is that one kinda bad scene, some more fighting, and then an incredible death, where Obi-Wan trusts fully in the Force to guide him to strike his small window of opportunity, as Kakashi charges at him full throttle, even after Obi-Wan crushes the Sharingan Eye. Then Obi-Wan ends it with a prequel quote and it made me do a smile. This is the weakest of the three SFM masterpieces before they changed to Blender in my opinion, and it's no longer even close to my top 5, but it's still an amazing showing. This is the first time my favourite episode of a season has never once changed, which could be down to my taste in episodes changing as time's gone on, but I'm sure this one in particular can be attributed to the episode's quality and that alone. Most impressive indeed. And with that, I'm free. I have now ranked the episodes in every single season of Death Battle. Oh my god, that took so much out of me. Well, I still have to wrap this up with an overview of Season 7 as a whole, and honestly, I think this season kinda gets a bad rap. It's far from the best the show has had. Seasons 2, 6, 8, and 9 all blow it out of the water, but I actually had a pretty fun time revisiting this season. It does have a lot of overlapping issues between episodes, like a lot of weak sound design, scenes that feel rushed, the cutaway gags and the analysis are generally really bad, and I don't think I even need to get into the bland season list and its overuse of comics. The increase in episodes from 16 to 20 definitely hurt it as well, since it feels like the season's resources were stretched far too thin. If 4 of the filler episodes could have been axed and had their budgets given to episodes like Danny vs Jake and Zuko vs Todoroki, which needed it more, we could have had a much higher average level of quality. As it is though, I think the average quality of these episodes was good. There are quite a few bad ones, but there are just as many bangers that I love. 12 episodes I like out of 20 isn't the worst ratio a season has. And when the good stuff has highlights like Obi Wan vs Kakashi, Beerus vs Galaxia, Machamp featuring Goro, and so on, there were plenty of reasons for me to go back to what this season had to offer. And I don't think most of them are nearly as character neglectful as people made them out to be. There are some like Genos vs War Machine and Danny vs Jake, but episodes like Obi Wan vs Kakashi, somehow Batgirl vs Spider-Gwen, and especially Cable vs Booster Gold, all bleed a passion for the characters involved. I don't even know where I'm going with this ending. I just quite like this season, and I think people give it way more shit than it deserves. It's still not one of the best seasons, but I wouldn't call it one of the worst either. Out of the 9 we currently have, I think this is better than 1, 3, and 4. Not quite sure which I prefer between this and season 5. Yeah, I have no clue where I'm going with this. This series of videos was such a big project and it took much more out of me than I ever could have imagined. I hope you enjoyed my overly long rambles. I hope you had a good holiday, hope you have a good new year. I hope you stick around to watch whatever non-Death Battle stuff I talk about next. I need to go to bed, I'm so tired, never ask me for anything again.